We're very excited today for our first guest, Dr. John Jackson from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. So, John, when we left off last time in our interview, we were talking about the process of how redistricting happens, and I love the way you used the phrase blue smoke-filled rooms and red smoke-filled rooms, not just smoke-filled rooms. One of the topics that I wanted to get to that we didn't last time is the notion of transparency and how much of this process is actually public, and in particular, how much of this process is actually public before the votes get taken. I was looking at some literature from the Midwest Democracy Network, and they did an analysis. I don't know if you've seen this, but they looked at the 5 states in the Midwest: Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin and Ohio, rather. And they did an analysis of how many days it took from the first time the map was shown till it got voted on until it got finalized in legislation. So in other words, from the introduction of the map to the first vote to passage. And I took the average of those 5 states, and it turned out that from the release of the map that was going to be voted on till the first time they voted on it, so in one chamber, it was 5 days. And the total time it took to pass the map in each state on average, in these states on average, was 10 days. And within that time, the average number of hearings that were conducted were roughly 2.5. So that was at the state level. And then at the federal level, from the time when the map was first released until they voted on it and passed it in the first chamber, it was only 3.5 days. So for the state level, it took 5 days to pass it. Here, only 3.5. And on average, to pass the bill was 10 days again. And for the congressional maps, they only had, on average, 1.5 hearings. So basically, you've got a scenario where from the time the map is released and like the go, we're going to vote on this, you've got only 3 to 5 days before it passes one house, and then basically only 3 to 5 days till it passes another house. So the public is only seeing this for 10 days at most, and they're only going to conduct 1 or 2 hearings during that period of time. So what are we doing wrong here that this is not only done in these smoke-filled rooms, but then we rush it through? We don't discuss it, we don't debate it, we just rush it through to get the result that people want.
I think the fair conclusion from that is the guys in the smoke-filled rooms with the computers and the maps are basically drawing the maps. There may be some incremental changes around the edges. There may ultimately be some compromise forced by the courts, but it's not really a very transparent operation. The public does get some input. It varies by state, but the public is not really all that interested, number one. Most people don't really understand redistricting and how important it is, and even those who do have a very difficult time getting an oar in the water.
Yeah, one of the guests on one of my previous shows basically said we've turned this thing upside down. In redistricting, the voters don't pick their representatives, the representatives pick their voters.
That's exactly right, and that leads to the very deeply red or deeply blue districts that we talked about earlier. It also means that the primary voters in some respects are more important than the general election voters. And as you know, primary turnout is always a fraction of the general election total. And so that means the party base on both sides is dominating who the candidates are going to be, and you're down to the last 2 choices once the general election comes along.
Now, some states have tackled this issue and have, I think they've actually voted as a state on changing the redistricting system. California and Florida, perhaps, they actually voted as the states?
California, Arizona, and Florida have all changed their process recently. We heard from California and Arizona and Florida in that conference that we put on in Springfield. I think the 2 examples in California and Arizona worked out very well from my understanding in the 2010-11 cycle. There's a lot of criticism about how Florida ultimately worked out because it now appears that the insiders ultimately were able to dominate the Florida process much more than you might think.
So when you mentioned the word insiders, which is, of course, is like a catchphrase in politics nowadays, which insiders is a bad thing. I'm not always in agreement that being an insider is a bad thing, but with redistricting, I think insider definitely is a bad word. How did these other states manage to change the dynamic? How did they get something on the ballot, and how did they get the population to wake up to the evils of this system? Any idea how that happened?
Well, it's by referendum, of course, and California is the easiest place to get referenda items on the ballot if you've got enough money, and they got that done originally because of the leadership of then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and a number of legislative leaders. The same thing happened in Arizona, and the same thing actually happened in Florida. So basically, it's a tough process, but in some states, various interest groups and leaders have gotten the public's attention, and the public will frequently vote for these reforms.
Well, that's interesting that you said that in those states, for instance, California, the Governor Schwarzenegger was behind this. I would have suspected that the incumbents would not have wanted to make these changes.
You would think that, but often sometimes the governor can be a little more removed and a little less immediately committed to the status quo, which turned out in that case to be the situation with Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time. Many in his own party were not very happy with him for having taken the lead on this particular item.
So in these states where they've sought to make changes, what is it that they're seeking to change? Or conversely, if you ruled the world, what would you try to change? What would be your goal in changing redistricting? What would you do?
Well, I think the ideal, in my view, is to get a somewhat more neutral process into place and somewhat reduce the level of partisanship that is self-evident. The granddaddy of them all in terms of the reforms is the Iowa system, and it's often pointed to as a model, and I think it is in many ways. It's a very technocratic, very number crunching driven system. They cannot consider incumbency, they cannot consider partisanship, they simply draw the map, and it's done by technocrats who work for the legislature with relatively little partisan influence. Iowa, on the other hand, not only is a good government state, it's also a very regular state that looks like a rectangular loaf of bread. So it's a little easier to do in Iowa than, say, in Illinois. As you know, we're a very irregular state and a very partisan state. In summary, my view is a mixture of what we have now and perhaps the very bloodless and technocratic situation in Iowa. I think there are inevitably going to be partisan considerations and places where the parties have a very clear advantage because of geography and housing patterns. There are always going to be some very clearly blue districts and some very clearly red districts. And we might as well start with that assumption. What we need, however, is way more marginal and competitive districts than we're getting now.
Are you finding, or whoever's doing the measuring, finding that in some of these states where they've made the transition, Iowa, California, Florida, Arizona, whatever, well, maybe not Florida because you said it may not have worked out as well there, but in these other states, are they in fact getting more competitive districts?
I think that is the record for a long time in Iowa, and my understanding is it turned out to be the record both for California and Arizona this time. In Florida, the Republicans had such total control of the state, both governor and the legislative body, that in spite of the referendum that had been passed that insisted on no consideration of partisanship and incumbency, they wound up considering it anyway, is my understanding of the conflict that's going on in Florida at this time.
So, yeah, I've heard of Iowa. They literally, as you said, it's just all computer model. They put the variables in and the numbers in, and the computer spits something out, correct?
That is correct, and they often throw incumbent legislators into the same district and they have to fight it out the next time around in very competitive districts.
You mentioned incumbency, and I'd like to talk about that for a minute or two. I don't think many people, again, think about redistricting, and then they don't think about incumbency within redistricting. You have these legislators, and they're living in their houses, right? And some of them have lived in their house since the day they were born, and they not only want to have a good district where they can be reelected, they want to make sure that they don't have to move, correct?
Oh, exactly. They would very much like to have the friendliest district possible, and they'd like their house to be right in the middle of it. And many times they get that. As you know, incumbency is the #1 consideration. Very, very difficult to defeat an incumbent. The rate of reelection to U.S. House seats is always above 90%. It's a little lower than that, somewhere between 70 and 80 for U.S. senators who have more competitive districts usually, because they have a full state, obviously. The rate of reelection in state legislative bodies is often near to that in the U.S. House. It's very difficult to beat an incumbent unless you take on the incumbent in the primary, as we discussed previously.
So in these states where they've gone to these different models, what I think they've done is they've tried to introduce neutrality in the makeup of the body that has the crayons, correct?
That is correct. And they won't let you consider where the incumbent lives or what the partisan composition of the various districts would look like based on past voting patterns.
Yeah, and I think another goal of some of these places where they've accomplished changes is to have, I don't know what they call the name of it, but to allow for the commonality of the voter. When I remember in Illinois, in Springfield was the state capital, I think in the previous map, 3 different congressional districts shared Springfield. So Springfield was just chopped up into pieces.
Yeah, that's true. And Bloomington Normal had the same problem. They had 3 different slices of state legislative districts in a city of, 120,000 or about 100,000 in Springfield. Those are things that should be avoided to the extent possible. There is the concept of protecting geographical boundaries that already exist. Almost all state constitutions and state legislation provides for that. Sometimes it gets blatantly ignored. The phrase that you were looking for is called communities of interest. That's not necessarily the same as the geographical boundaries of a county or a city, for example, although they can be the same thing. But most state legislative acts, as well as constitutions, put a premium on protecting those boundaries and protecting those communities of interest. But if something has to give in competition with incumbency and partisanship always hold sway.
And then we're back to the gerrymandering where they get to draw a district that is going to pretty much guarantee re-election, if not for them, but someone else in their party.
Exactly. And then they slice up Springfield 3 different ways and Bloomington Normal 3 different ways.
Well, this has been very helpful, and I know that there's an effort through the Midwest Democracy Network in these different 6 states in the Midwest to try and create some energy to get to some of these differing approaches like they did in California and Arizona. If someone wanted to drill down in Illinois and take a look at the Simon Institute and get a little more information on this and look at your program on Who Has the Crayons, how do they get to your site? How do they learn about the program and get better educated on this topic?
We have a website, paulsimoninstitute.siu.edu, and we'd be happy to have visitors. We have a lot of good information on that website, and we're constantly updating it. We'd be delighted to have visitors.
Well, thank you, John. You've been a terrific guest, and if I were going back to school again, I'd want to take one of your classes because you explain things just so clearly and that anyone that's listening to you can't help but come away with a great understanding of your topic. So you're a great gentleman, and we thank you for your time.
Okay, Steve, it was a pleasure being on and visiting with you.